I first traveled to the Himalaya of Nepal in the fall of 1973 and ended up living and working there for more than 2 decades. For the first 2 years of my life in Nepal, I became very close to an elderly woman, a subsistence farmer who lived in a remote village in the foothills of the Himalaya. But that's only the beginning of an unusual story that has profoundly affected me ever since.
Eyes on Longmont, offering a diversity of topics about our community that will inform and entertain you. We invite you to sit back and enjoy this edition of Eyes on Longmont.
In the summer of 1990, I had an unusual travel experience. With 2 companions, I took a trip that turned into an odyssey, and from there it turned into a pilgrimage in search of the soul of America. And ultimately it turned into a search for our own souls. Well, the story began really 30 years ago when I was assigned by the Peace Corps to teach science in a high school on a ridge at 5,000 feet in Nepal's central Himalaya, directly south of the Annapurna range. And I didn't want to live in the somewhat commercially oriented village where the school was located, so I hiked 15 minutes along the ridge until I came to a small hamlet inhabited by people of the Gurung tribe. And I introduced myself to the headman of this village and asked him if there might be someone who could arrange food and lodging for me for a period of 2 years. Well, he laughed and he told me to come back the next day. But when I returned the next day, he apologized and said that all he could find for me was the hayloft of a water buffalo shed attached to the house of an elderly woman who didn't speak a word of English and wouldn't know what to do with the money that I had offered. Well, I took one look at Aama here on the left, and something told me that we would have a mutual bond of fate. Aama had never given birth to a son, which cast something of a stigma on a woman in traditional Hindu-Buddhist society as being only partially fertile. And my own mother had passed away when I was 19 years old. So therein lay our mutual bond of fate. And besides, when I learned her native language of Gurung and also the national language of Nepal, which is Nepali, I began to help Aama with her chores, her daily chores of carrying water from the spring below the village and also collecting firewood from the forest. In essence, I was the son who had fallen from the heavens. Well, in the summer of 1990, I was living and working in Nepal's capital of Kathmandu for the United Nations, and I was about to depart with my girlfriend Didi, who I was living with in Kathmandu. I was about to depart for the United States on summer home leave. And before Didi and I left the country, I suggested to her that we hike up to Aama's village and at least say goodbye before we return to America. And as we left the lowlands from Pokhara at 3,000 feet and hiked 4,000 vertical feet to Aama's village, I wondered if Aama was even still alive. Mail delivery from the village is slow, and the faces of the villagers that we met along the trail didn't tell me. Well, when we arrived in Aama's village, we found her not only alive, but vital and thriving. And on something of a lark, but also perhaps because of a feeling of a debt of gratitude that I felt to Aama and her villagers for all the hospitality they had shown me. And also perhaps because of a feeling of gratitude I felt to my own deceased mother. I asked Aama if she would like to go to America with us. And I did that without conferring with Didi first. And Aama laughed and she said, well, you know that us old hill women, that we always try to die promptly when we're no longer able to support ourselves. And I already tried to die and that didn't happen, so why not go to America with you? And besides, Aama had passed something of a spiritual watershed. She had turned 84 years old, and it's at when the elderly person has lived the sacred number of 1008 full moons of life, that the Brahmin priests and the Buddhist lamas perform a long life ritual that effectively grants the elderly person a release from their lives of worldly obligation and from their duties as a householder. So effectively, when Aama completed this ritual, she was living on free time. And it's at that point that the priests and the lamas suggest that the elderly person either go on a retreat into the forest to meditate to gain additional spiritual merit before death, or alternatively, that they go on a pilgrimage. They go on a pilgrimage of holy sites to gain additional merit before they pass away. And when Aama's people go on pilgrimage, typically they will hike up to the headwaters of the sacred Ganges River, such as this lake at 16,000 feet at the hem of the Himalaya, and cast themselves into the freezing cold water for purification and to achieve a favorable rebirth in the next life. And Aama and her younger cousin had been on pilgrimage some years before when they hiked up the world's deepest river gorge to the sacred temple of Muktinath, located on the north side of the Himalaya, 10 days walk from Aama's home. And it was here at this temple at 12,000 feet that the two women did 3 circuits, 3 circumambulations beneath the 108 water spouts that are connected to a stream that issues from the hillside above this temple. Again, to gain additional spiritual merit before death. Now, Aama had heard vague but compelling stories about what an amazing, wonderful place America was. And that was something that could only be explained by the fact that America must be a very holy place. America must be a very sacred place. And so she felt she was coming here on pilgrimage. She gave a farewell tika blessing to her youngest granddaughter, wishing that the wisdom and the light of all of the deities be with her. And she did the same for her next eldest granddaughter, and for one of her nieces, and for her favorites, the twin nieces, Gore and Parvati, who would take every chance they had to leave their village 2,000 vertical feet below Aama's and hike up to Aama's village simply to help her with her daily chores. Aama came to Kathmandu, Nepal's capital, which is rapidly transiting from the 12th into the 21st century. And she made offerings and took blessings at the Buddhist shrine of Bodhanath and also at the Hindu shrine of Pashupatinath, where bodies are cremated by the side of the river. Aama said that she hoped she wouldn't turn into a corpse, as she put it, while traveling in America, partly because there might not be Buddhist lamas or Hindu priests to properly consecrate or bless her body if she were to die in this country. But mostly, if she were to die in America, she felt, it would be a burden on Didi and me. Here, Aama is remembering that although the astrologers had told her that she would lead a long life, they also said that she would face many obstacles. Well, we didn't have a lot of time for obstacles. We were on a roll. We not only had to get Aama a visa to the United States, we had to get her a passport. And to get a passport, she needed citizenship papers. And to get citizenship papers, the team that provided those had come through her village and didn't offer them to Aama. They said, why would a woman of her age ever need such a thing? I remember that on one of our early motorcycle excursions, she had me stop the bike and tell her why it was that I always drove the motorcycle in windy places. She wasn't afraid of flying. In fact, she really wasn't afraid of much at all. She felt that she had cast her fate with the deities, that she was in the hands of the gods. And I remember we were at 35,000 feet at one point, and she tucked what ended up being about 15 tubs of airline butter into her waistband, and Dee Dee ended up fishing out these tubs of butter up to 2 weeks later, and she laughed and said, "You think it's so funny that something as valuable as butter is so precious to our people." Aama's people wear that sash around their waist, the 20-foot long sash, rather tight. It's used to strengthen their backs while working in the fields. When we arrived in Seattle, her first impression was, this is a new city. They have only just created this place. Otherwise, the streets and the sidewalks would be thronged and crowded with people. And then, referring to the background noise that seems to permeate all of our cities, she said, and what's that sound over there I hear all the time, going nyung, 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 like a flour mill constantly turning? Is that the ocean over there making that sound, or is it the wind passing through your buildings? Well, we bought a used station wagon that Dee Dee nicknamed the Street Sweeper, and we took off overland. Initially, our furthest destination was Dee Dee's family home in San Diego. But little did we realize that our journey would take us over 13,000 miles over a period of 2.5 months. We were prepared to turn around at any point if Aama became sick or disoriented, or simply if she wanted to return to Nepal. But we knew that the trip couldn't be made without Dee Dee, who not only had to dress Aama, help her out with getting dressed, but also to bathe her. We began to feel like unexpected parents out of wedlock. Well, I wondered if Aama might be afraid of technology, but it turned out that she was more amused by it than anything. When she saw a computer, she said it must have taken many minds working with great harmony to be able to put together something like this. But it couldn't possibly have any useful purpose. Technology in general didn't seem to faze her, at least that is until she saw an American refrigerator. She said, "Is this a shop front? Is all of this food for sale?" And then she looked into the refrigerator to see where the shopkeeper might sit. Because in fact an American refrigerator is barely smaller than a merchant's stall in a bazaar town high in the Himalayas. But this was really only a warm-up for an American supermarket. She had an endless string of questions about how it all worked, and she was wondering, for instance, if the people who own each and every item in the store, if they take their items home with them at night and then bring it all back the next day and set it up for sale. And in the liquor aisle, she said, "Don't let that scoundrel alcoholic son-in-law of mine in here." And at the end of one of the aisles, she accepted a free sample of microwaved chicken from a hostess. And then she dispatched Dee Dee and me back into the store to buy a gift, to give this woman in exchange. And I said, "But Aama, we don't need to do that. You see, it's free food." And she said, "Why would anybody stand around and pass out free food?" And I said, "Well, it's a new kind of food, and they hope that if people like it, they'll buy some." And she said, "Well, since when is chicken a new kind of food?" And at Marine World Africa, USA in Vallejo, California, at the end of the Marine Mammals Show, Aama was invited down to the edge of the killer whale tank to greet the orca. And she gave it a long blessing about living in peace and harmony with all of the other fish and creatures of the sea. And she said, may you not eat people, and in turn, may you not be eaten by people. And then, as we were driving out of the parking lot at Marine World, Aama laughed in that way that made Dee Dee and me curious. And I said, what's so funny? And she said, you know, you Americans are so amazing the way you can put what appears to be the breath of life into a giant mechanical fish. And I looked at her dumbstruck and looked at Dee Dee, and I said to Aama, what, you mean you think it's a machine? And she said, of course it's a machine. I may be from the hills, but I know about fish. It must have springs and wires and electricity inside it that make it work. And at that point, knowing that Aama could often be stubborn, I thought for a moment, and I said, well, Aama, if that's a machine, then why did you give it a blessing? And she said, well, I did that because it's your friends who run the thing, right? And they saw that I was the only foreigner in the audience and figured that I wouldn't know what the trick was. So when they called me down, I played along so I wouldn't embarrass you in front of your friends. Now don't go and tell them that I know it's a machine. And so at that point, wondering how I could convince her that it was actually real, we were driving a few days later down the coast of California toward the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And I thought that at the aquarium we could show her the porpoises and dolphins behind the glass walls of the tank there and compare them to orcas, to killer whales. But when we walked in the entrance of the Monterey Bay Aquarium, there hanging from the atrium are in fact two life-size plastic replicas of killer whales, and she looked up and said, there they are, that's where they store them after they do that show. But it was really when Aama viewed the types of technology that she and her villagers perform in her own village that she became quiet and considered, even slightly fearful almost. In the state of Washington, when she saw a high-speed wheat combine with a 16-foot header on it, she went into a state of what I called agriculture shock. She was impressed by it, but she was also humbled and belittled by it, as if it was almost making a mockery of their subsistence lifestyle, where they have to do everything by hand, such as they are here, planting millet shoots between the corn stalks. But later on in the grain elevator, she warmed up and she began to understand, and she wanted to contribute to the harvest in any small way that she possibly could. And so here she's inspecting the grain to see that it has the proper moisture content to be safely stored after harvest. And on a corn farm in Illinois, she waded out into the corn patch and was inspecting the ears of corn. And I saw that she became disturbed, and she had me summon the farmer off of his tractor, and she called him over. And she said to him in a confrontational way, the land here is crying, for I see not only individual kernels of grain lying on the ground here, but I see entire ears of corn that have been trampled by the wheels of your harvesting machine. We people say, our Gurung people say, that whenever we waste or spoil grain on the ground, we must forego eating an equivalent amount of grain ourselves. It was difficult for Aama to understand, considering that her people feel that all of their land and also their livestock are sacred. In fact, they say a prayer before taking any milk from their livestock, especially the sacred cow, because the sacred cow provides them with so much, with fertilizer to fertilize their fields, with dung to plaster on the walls of their houses, with sustenance of milk and butter, and draft power to pull their plows. When we took Aama to the milking parlor of a dairy farm in upstate New York, again, she became concerned and she was trembling slightly. She said, "I'm not sure you should have even taken me to this place where the farmers are removing milk in this mechanical fashion, and I hear no evidence of the farmers invoking the goddess Lakshmi, who is the goddess of wealth, for indeed the sacred cow is an embodiment of the goddess Lakshmi. Our people say that although we drink our mother's milk in infancy, we drink cow's milk all our lives." And in upstate New York, when she saw a log loader throwing pine logs around as if they were mere sticks, she physically pushed Didi and me toward the machine, saying, "Go ahead, worship this machine, make offerings to this machine, do rituals on top of this machine, for it provides you with all that you need and with all that you want." Interestingly, just as the sacred cow does for the Hindu. Again, this was something difficult for her to see, considering how they had to do all of their work by hand. And in fact, Aama was climbing trees until she was well into her 70s to cut fodder for her water buffalo and for her cow. The kind of work that produces calluses like this. I remember that we were at a department store in Seattle. We had to buy Aama some shoes because you need them to get into establishments in America. And as she was being fitted for a pair of boys' quadruple E wide sneakers, a tear came to her eye, and I asked Aama what the problem was. And she said, "Why would you want to buy something as precious as shoes for an old woman like me who is about to die?" Well, along the Columbia River Gorge in the state of Oregon, Aama effectively decompressed. When we pulled into a campground and I paid the campground attendant $10, she took me aside and she said, "Why did you pay that man money?" And I said, "Well, that's so we can stay here at this campsite." And she said, "You have to pay money to sleep outside in this jungle camp? Well, when do they bring the food?" And I said, "Well, they don't bring the food, and that's why Didi was unpacking the boxes with food onto the picnic table." And at that point, Aama stood up, and she was turning and beseeching the trees and the forest around us to tell her why it was that in America there seemed to be so little evidence of sacredness and of devotion and of spirituality and sometimes even common hospitality. Her people consider it an honor to provide hospitality to passing travelers. In fact, they have a proverb that says, "Evening guests bring luck." And so that night, as the three of us lay in our tent, Didi and I talked about what Aama was saying. And we agreed that if, in fact, in America, there was some evidence of sacredness and devotion and spirituality, we would try to find it. And so the next morning, from the contents of an informational brochure, we found our way to a 64-acre Catholic sanctuary known as the Grotto outside of Portland, Oregon. And when Aama learned that we were going to a place that is sacred to our people, she had us remove our belts and our shoes, which are made out of the sacred cow leather, and gather together candles and flowers and matches and incense and sacred cow dung, which we had a little trouble finding right at that moment, and also water, which she is here collecting from a stream that flows through the grotto compound. And then moments later, she entered the amphitheater-like compound, which features an 80-foot-high overhang with a replica of Michelangelo's Pieta. And she broke through all the chains and barriers meant to keep out the general public, and she went right up to the base of the shrine, and she placed her offerings on the mantle below the Pieta. And she stood back and did 3 prostrations. And when she stood up from her prostrations, she placed her hands together in prayer And she said, "I have come in ignorance, but I am grateful for this opportunity to present myself before these deities, and may others share this opportunity. Although these deities have a different name than ours, they are the same." And at that point, there were 2 busloads of Catholic Charters pilgrims who were strolling through the pews of the amphitheater-like compound there, and every single person was frozen in mid-stride, captured in this moment of time as a Hindu-Buddhist woman from the other side of the world was effectively expressing as much devotion as they, or more. And so we took Aama to churches and cathedrals where she prayed and made offerings. In Santa Fe, New Mexico, she was surprised and a bit disturbed to find that the doors to a church would ever be closed. And so she left her offerings on the door of the church. But it wasn't long after that that we arrived at a place that became very sacred in Aama's memory, a place that is open all of the time, and that was Disneyland. She was ecstatic. She was so happy that we had arrived there on a day when they were having a religious festival, and that there were so many devout people who were congregated as well. And so she dug into her sash and pulled out her drawstring pouch and was casting coins at the feet of the dancers, even though I had told her we'd already thrown away enough money just getting in there in the first place. But her joy here was eclipsed a few moments later when she had an opportunity for an audience with a being that she considered to be the king of all of the animated creatures that she had seen on television. In fact, perhaps he was the king of mice. And so she gave him a long blessing, asking that the wisdom of the deities be with him, and that he be blessed by having many children and many grandchildren. And as you can imagine, many of those grandchildren were milling about waiting for their turn for an audience with the king of mice. Well, I swear we didn't plan on taking Aama to Las Vegas, but we had to drive through Las Vegas on our way to the Rocky Mountains. And if you've driven across the Mojave Desert at night, you know that you can see the lights of the city from nearly 30 miles away. And when Aama asked us about what was ahead, I explained to her that we were about to pass through a place where a lot of Americans do some really serious gambling. And she said, "Well, you know that us old hill women, that we never gamble. So if you and Dee Dee want to go into this place, whatever it is, and throw your money away like fools, you go right ahead while I wait in the car." But as we pulled up to the corner of Caesar's Palace in the dunes, she became radiant. She was sitting in the back seat at that point, and her hand reached for the door, and she issued out onto the sidewalk as we were stopped at a stoplight. I bailed out after her while Dee Dee went to park the car. And she was turning and basking in the waves and pulses of colored light. And she said, "This place too is sacred, for the goddess Lakshmi, who of course is the goddess of light, only comes to well-lighted places." And so she asked me if the people who turn on and off every light in Las Vegas, if they say the name of God each time they do. Well, we loaned Aama 2 rolls of quarters, and she said that because it wasn't her own money that she was gambling with, that it was all right. And so here she's blessing a quarter before placing it into a slot machine. But it was really the natural features of our continent that impressed Aama with the sacredness of America. When she learned that the Pacific Ocean here off the coast of Oregon is connected to all of the oceans of the world and thereby to the sacred Ganges River, she knew that our trip to America had been worthwhile. And so she took Dee Dee and me down to the California and the Oregon coast to bathe for purification and to effect a favorable rebirth in the next life. I remember we were on the coast of Oregon and we were wading out into the ocean and we were walking through a backwash of a wave that was about 4 inches deep. And Aama looked down and became disoriented by the moving water, and she fell forward face first into the returning surf. And I panicked and lunged for her as salty, sandy water was streaming over the back of her head, and I tried to pull her up, but it was as if the suction was holding her down. I was afraid I might break some ribs. But very quietly, calmly, almost thoughtfully, Aama pushed herself up, and as salty, sandy water streamed off her hair and face, it was as if she had been baptized. She said, "Even if I had died in this place, it would have been favorable, for we say that it is auspicious to die with Ganges water in your mouth." And so she really came alive in places where she felt the landscape had been sculpted by the deities, such as at the Grand Canyon and here at Canyon de Chelly. And in the redwoods, she said, "Even this place is sacred, and you must not go about and urinate anywhere. And in this place you must not even speak harsh words, for the trees and the life around us all has sacredness." And in the redwoods, we walked through the hollowed out but living trunk of a tree. And Aama had us do 3 circumambulations through this living tree. And each time we passed, we had to chant, "Stomach ailments, go!" Because it's believed that if you can pass your entire body through a living thing, such as walking beneath the legs of an elephant, that it will help you get rid of stomach ailments. And then Didi had to do 3 additional circumambulations through the tree. And each time Didi passed through the tree, Didi had to chant, "Uterus obstructions, go!" because Didi hadn't given birth to any children yet. But when we camped near a high-altitude lake in Colorado, in the morning when we awoke, Aama found her way to the edge of the lake before she had spoken a single word or introduced into her mouth any food. And as she squatted by the edge of the lake and turned toward the sun, the god Surya for the Hindus, and drained water from her cupped hands, she performed her morning ablution, in which the names of all of the sacred places of the Indian subcontinent would come to her in a sequence, she said, that she could never remember during the daytime if you asked her, but would flow forth as she recited them during her morning ablution. And to give you an idea of how her prayers unfold, here's a sample of an evening devotional song that Aama sings.
Jai Sanjay Sanero, Hari Sanjay Sanero, Jai Sanjay Sanero, Hari Sanjay Sanero, Yodana Sampati Tero Na Mera Oji.
Well, hot water is especially sacred to the Hindus and Buddhists. So when we went to Yellowstone, she couldn't help but mispronounce Yellowstone as Yatrastan, which is Sanskrit for holy place of pilgrimage. And at Old Faithful, she remained in devout prayer for nearly 20 minutes after the eruption of the geyser had completely subsided. For nearly 20 minutes after all the people here on the boardwalk had long since run off to beat the notorious post-eruption traffic jam at Old Faithful. And when she finished her prayer and arose, she took Didi and me by the hand, and as we walked down the empty boardwalk, Aama broke away from us, and she went right up to a middle-aged couple that was coming the other way, and she confronted them, speaking in Nepali, saying, "Why have you come here? Do you know the deities that reside beneath the hot water? Or have you only come to sit and eat your lunch like the overweight, red-cheeked people who look like army officers during this magnificent display of the deities? Do you know the deities that reside here? At Niagara Falls, we rode the Maid of the Mist up to the base of the falls. And Aama again became excited and devout, and she placed her hands together in prayer. And she reached into her sash and pulled out her drawstring pouch. And as she was casting coins in the swirling maelstrom of water, she said, "Finally, we have come to a place where I've heard some evidence of your people's respect for the deities that most certainly reside beneath the features of this natural phenomenon." She said, "I heard someone there speaking over that horn saying Namaste, which is the honorific form of greeting throughout the Himalaya. But I didn't really have the heart to tell her that it was actually a recorded message saying no smoking on the passenger deck." And oddly, the most sacred site that Aama found in America, she found right in the heart of New York City. At the Museum of Natural History there, when she learned that the Great Arizona Meteorite was an object that had fallen from the heavens, again, she became devout, and she did several circumambulations of the meteorite, and she took blessing from it, and she prayed to it, and again she dug into her sash, pulled out her drawstring pouch, and as she was throwing coins on the top of the meteorite, I caught the eye of the attendant who was leaning against the nearby doorway there, and he shrugged and said, "Hey, this is New York, I've seen everything." And she became a Pied Piper to children. In public places especially, children would escape from their parents' grasp and run down the aisle and release themselves into Aama's hands, and she would run her fingers through their hair. She said, "It's especially the youngest children who like to see me, the children who haven't yet learned not to love people." And when we visited friends in the state of Maine, the first thing their children wanted to do was to take Aama to school with them. One of these children asked if the people in Aama's village ever die. And with this young man, she spent over an hour and a half in the garden that he had planted, digging potatoes, gathering squash and tomatoes and beans, for now it was the month of September. And the entire time, the two of them were chattering away to each other. He was speaking in English, and Aama was speaking in Nepali and Gurung. And when they came into the house, he announced to his mother, he said, "Hey, Mom, you know, I can understand everything that Aama says. And she can understand me too. You know, she sees the world like us kids do. She's one of us." And at a Hutterite colony on the eastern slope of the Montana Rockies, Aama was beholding a cultural apparition. For here, during the first time of our pilgrimage to America, she was witnessing a people who live on the fruits of their own effort. She said, "These people are like us. Why, the rest of you Americans, I've seen unmarried people walking around as if they're married, and I see married people walking around as if they're unmarried. And I've seen you treat your relatives as if they were strangers, and you treat strangers as if they were your relatives. Who are you?" Aama challenged Didi and me. "Who are you?" Well, she wasn't disappointed when we finally arrived at Didi's family home in San Diego, especially when she learned that Didi's mother, a good Catholic woman, had given birth to 14 children. And indeed, Didi has 13 brothers and sisters who are still alive. And so Aama had Didi take her down the rather long hallway of the family home and not only identify all of her relatives by their name, but also by their kinship term, which is the form of address that is used in villages which describes the precise relationship between the person speaking and the person being addressed. But that's really only an example of the importance of family to Aama and her people. For in fact, their lives are oriented around family values. And family values to them means not only the nuclear family, but also the extended family. And from there, beyond that, to the clan and the ethnic group and the community around them. For within the clan and the community and the extended family especially are built-in systems for child care, for care of the elderly, for education and for law and for religion. Well, Aama felt a family link, at least a clan or a racial link, to this woman, a Taos Pueblo elder who is showing Aama her bread oven. And the two women agreed that the blood flowing through their veins is the same blood. And when I explained to Aama that actually these people many years ago broke off from Aama's ancestors and crossed a land bridge and settled in America, at least it's believed they did, Aama looked around and she said, well, judging by all the TVs and cars they have here, I think a few more of our people should have crossed that bridge you're talking about and come and settled here. They look like they're doing pretty well. And she felt an almost family link with this young man, a man of the Gurung tribe, her ethnic group that we ran into entirely by accident on the Boston Common. And he spotted Aama from 100 yards away, and by the time he approached us on the sidewalk, a tear had formed in his eye. He said, she reminds me so much of my own mother, because of course Aama was wearing the traditional velvet blouse and coral and gold necklace and earrings. And so the two of them laughed and talked about life in Nepal, where hailstones can destroy their crops and it's so difficult to maintain their livestock. And they told stories about America and Americans, at our expense, of course. For instance, they said, isn't it amazing how Americans will blow their nose into a piece of cloth and then save it? But a low point came during our journey when Aama had a realistic and undeniable vision that her only daughter, Sun Maya, had passed away. And we didn't know if it was a dream or a daydream she'd had while napping in the car, but we couldn't talk her out of it. She knew that it was true. And so at that point, I asked Aama if she would like to return to Nepal. And she said, no, there's no need to now. They would have already cremated her body. And besides, I have no one else of my generation to return to. For indeed, Aama was the eldest person in her village, and all of her peers, those of her generation, had passed away before her. And we knew that Aama would want to be back in the village for the fall festival season, especially the festival honoring Lakshmi, the goddess of lights. And so as we passed back through Seattle, we could see, as Aama was remembering her only daughter, Sun Maya, on her face, she was also registering her own mortality. And so the night before we were to board the plane for Nepal, she asked if she could bathe her face in cold water for a change, in preparation for returning to the village. And as she did so, she said a long prayer. And as part of that prayer, she said, until the moment when I breathe my last dying fistful of air, I wish to remember the names and the faces and the deeds of all the American people I have met. Well, we arrived back in Nepal, and Aama was quite surprised to find her only daughter, Sun Maya, here in the middle, very much alive. And it was Sun Maya who said that she was convinced that Aama had turned into a corpse, as she put it, while traveling in America. And they agreed, as Aama is here with one of her cousins from a distant village, that she would have to add an addition to her house, a new room on her house, so that all of her relatives would have a place to stay while she told stories about crab claw machines throwing logs around and mechanical fish. But I should let you know that sometime after Aama returned to the village, some complications developed in her life. And they also developed in Dee Dee's and my life. And I'll spare you those details. They're covered in the book Aama in America. But during the month of January in 1997, Aama lost her appetite and she stopped eating. And on the full moon of that month, while sitting on her porch, looking out over the fields and the forests and the terraces of her youth, just as she had wanted, she quietly passed away. And on her lips, just before her moment of death, were the names of her ancestors, her relatives, of Dee Dee and me, and of all the American people she had met on her long, final pilgrimage. Aama found America to be a beautiful, a sacred, and a blessed place. And part of the blessing that we all share, she said, is our material wealth. And that's something we should take no more for granted than the next breath we breathe. And for me personally, Aama taught me that nature and spirituality are what endure, and that family, and especially children, are what provide us with hope. Originally, I went to Aama's village to teach, but I ended up being taught. Aama came to America to learn, but she ended up teaching. Thanks very much.
Yodana sampati tero na mera oji. Bana da more pasi dantave chorsa korko korko. Chora gare choi samajda gere more pasi koshona ganza. Bana pura audio. Jai Sanjay Sanero Hari Sanjay Sanero Jai Sanjay Sanero Hari Sanjay Sanero Yodana Sampati Tero na mera oji. Jai Sanjay Sanero Hari Sanjay Sanero Jai Sanjay Sanero Hari Sanjay Sanero Yodana Sampati Tero na mera oji.